The ugly truth is, we've all been lying to you. Welcome back to Writing in Real Life. I'm Neil Christensen, author of Dark White and host of Book Talk Writers Group. This is the place where we talk you step by excruciating step through the long and complicated process of writing, editing, formatting, publishing, and selling your first novel. Last time, we talked about how your idea is the most important thing you have going for you. We dove into what it means to be a writer and how you can find time in your busy life to actually get that writing done. Now, we have an important decision to make. But that decision is more of an illusion than you may think. This week, it's Plotter versus Pantser on Writing in Real Life. You have no doubt heard the terms plotter and pantser bandied about in writing circles. You may have even heard hybrid terms like plantser. You probably know the basics of what these terms mean. A plotter is a writer that sits down and meticulously plans out their novel before ever writing a word of prose. They outline the story beats, make character biographies, map out their worlds, and know exactly what is going to happen and when, often to a specific place in the word count. A pantser, on the other hand, is someone who has that idea we discussed last week and just sits down and starts writing. They feel their way through the story, often surprising themselves when things happen or characters develop differently than they expected. They know a little bit about their main character and the tone of the story, but don't feel the necessity to have the whole thing planned out in advance. Knowing what kind of writer you are is important. It will save you time and frustration in the process of getting your first draft finished. But the unfortunate truth that ends up hurting a lot of new writers is that neither of these kinds of writers is entirely what it seems. First, let's talk about plotters. There are actually a lot of different ways to be a plotter, and a lot of different degrees of it as well. But they almost always have one thing in common, and that's a strong belief in utilizing some version of the hero's journey. You may have heard of this before, probably in ninth grade English class. The hero's journey is a story structure popularized by Joseph Campbell. You might also hear it called the monomyth. Basically, it says that all stories in the Western storytelling culture follow the same structure and contain the same basic plot beats. Campbell argues that telling a story in this way and adhering to these plot beats makes the story connect with its audience, and that skipping or missing any of these beats leave the reader feeling like something was missing. These plot beats are broken down into a 3-act structure: the departure, the initiation, and the return. Within these acts are the individual beats. In the departure, we have the call to adventure, refusal of the call, supernatural aid, the crossing of the first threshold, and the belly of the whale. In the initiation, we have the road of trials, the meeting with the goddess, woman as the temptress, atonement with the father, apotheosis, and the ultimate boon. In the return, we have refusal of the return, the magic flight, rescue from without, crossing the return threshold, master of the two worlds, and freedom to live. Now, this can sound a little outdated. The terms give fantasy, very Tolkien, Lord of the Rings sounding. But the truth is that most Western stories do follow this pattern, even stories outside the fantasy genre. In 2007, Christopher Vogler updated the terminology and condensed some of the more minute beats together to come up with something that feels a little more modern. Ordinary world, call to adventure, refusal of the call, meeting with the mentor, crossing the first threshold, tests, allies, and enemies, approach to the inmost cave, the ordeal, reward, the road back, the resurrection, and return with the elixir. Not super modern, but it's better. So a plotter will take these beats and build their story around them in a very intentional way. I know authors that use index cards. They will decide that they're going to write a book that's 100,000 words, and they will put a word count in the top of the card, then the story beats from the structure, and then fill in what their characters are doing here to adhere to this story beat. They will go scene by scene and figure out exactly what's happening in each of these scenes on the cards. Nothing is surprising or unexpected. Then, when they sit down to write, they go through the cards one by one and flesh out the story, making sure that each story beat happens at the word count that they planned it for. There are even spreadsheets out there that'll help authors do this. You'll stick your word count in a box at the top, and it calculates for you exactly where each plot point should occur. Other plotters aren't quite so meticulous in their pre-planning. They will simply outline the story, 1 or 2 pages with these plot points as headings and some general description of where they are in the story as bullet points inside these headings. Character biographies are another big tool for plotters. They make a page for each major character and list out their backstory, description, personality traits, etc. Some people get very detailed with art that represents what the characters look like, and maybe even details like the character's education, favorite foods, or unusual quirks. A plotter goes into their first draft with the story basically completed, and that first draft is just converting it into prose. If you're very detail oriented or a type A personality, plotting may be your way of writing. Pantsers are exactly the opposite of this. A pantser has a general idea of the kind of story they want to tell, and maybe a moment in the story that speaks to them. They probably know a little bit about their main character, not everything, but maybe the details that would show up on the character's dating profile. When the pantser sits down to write, they just spill words on a page. They let the feeling of the story guide them through the process, and they discover things about their characters and their world along the way, the same as the character does. Pantsers often talk about their characters going off script. They roll with it, learning the story as they tell it. It's improvisational and spontaneous. Pantsers do tend to need more heavy-duty editing in the second draft, and often even have to go back and make changes during the first draft when something in the story changes that conflicts with something written earlier. Editing takes longer, and pantsers often have to make more cuts in the following drafts because they haven't planned for a specific word count. But if you're a laid-back person that doesn't like lists and rules, and you don't mind the editing process, being a pantser might be what feels right for you. But just like in politics and economics, neither of these theories of writing really works in their purest form for most writers. The most ardent plotters I know tell me all the time that as they're beginning to actually write and get to know their characters, their feelings about them change. They want them doing different things or making different choices. They're surprised at who these well thought out people end up being once they're actually on the page. Sometimes they get to a story beat, and no matter how hard they try, they can't make it work the way they had planned, and changes have to be made. Die-hard plotters will then often stop writing, go back and rework these details in their outline or story sheets. Once they have fixed the issue, they'll start writing again. But I also know plotters that when the shit hits the fan, they slide into pantser mode and just keep writing until the story fixes itself. And then they can go back and find their way back to the outline they created. Pantsers, too, plot more than they actually think they do. For example, most pantsers I know, including myself, find it very important to know how their story ends before they get very far in the writing. Without a clear ending in mind, the story can ramble and go on and on without direction, becoming a stream of consciousness with no plot or real story. Also, most pantsers follow some form of the hero's journey in their writing. They may not plan it out, but it intuitively develops from an inherent understanding of how stories are told in our culture. Pantsers may not get those story beats in quite the right place in the first draft, but through editing and feedback, we'll usually make the adjustments to line up those points in future revisions. It's okay to identify yourself in one of these camps. It's natural and even useful in terms of developing your style and writing habit, but it's also very important not to paint yourself into a corner creatively just to adhere to a style as a kind of self-identity. If you're a pantser and you find yourself stuck, then building an outline and referring to either Campbell's or Vogler's structures to help you out of your rut is useful. Don't avoid the tools that are available to you just because you don't think you're that kind of writer. Conversely, if you're a plotter, don't keep writing something that isn't working just because you put in all the time plotting it out. Be willing to let go a little and let your imagination go where it wants. Close your eyes and let your characters tell you what they want to do. You don't have to toss away your whole system just because you tried a little bit of improvisation. Finding the writing style that works for you is important, but don't let the vocabulary of the community limit you in your expression of your creativity. Use all the tools in your garage to make your story the best it can be. Once you've figured out what system works best for you, you're ready to move on to the next step. Writing a great first chapter. That's what's next time on Writing in Real Life.